Good day everyone, today is the start of a new week and what we are doing on this cold and rainy Monday is take a look at how the raid has been going. Not because we are interested in the usual things that we look at when we look at the raid performance and the popularity of the classes and specs, but because what has happened recently is of course the patch 9.1.5, which has gone to influence quite a few things when it comes to the classes and the specs. We do have the AoE cap being lifted from certain specs, but this is not as important in raid encounters because the AoE is not that prevalent. This is something that we're going to take a better look at when it comes to Mythic Plus. That's when the AoE becomes the real focus of the activity, whereas for this activity, for the raid, what is more important is the ability to change covenants, to swap covenants. This is going to allow us to see which of the covenants have been played more compared to just a week ago when you basically still couldn't. Where if you were a Kyrian Arms Warrior, you had to stay Kyrian for raid encounters as well, not just because you wanted it for Mythic Plus. Now that you can swap, now that you can move around, we can start taking a look. Now, it is still pretty early, so we can go and have a preliminary look because it's just been pretty much more or less 3 raid nights for the majority of guilds that have gone through this, Wednesday, Thursday and Sunday. Plus, perhaps many players are still not feeling confident in raiding on a different covenant because they haven't brought it to Renown 80 yet. So as we go deeper, as we go by next week and probably a couple of weeks from now, there is going to be much more room for players to play whichever covenant they want, since they will have very likely brought it up to max Renown and everything else. So for now, we can just take a look at the initial preliminary numbers for the new patch, the data for the raid in this new 9.1.5 patch. So the first thing, as usual, even if we will be taking a closer look at the new changes of the patch, is still to look at the popularity of the specs. So with the release of the new patch, the slate was wiped clean. We have started again from 0. This is cool. It's interesting because it lets you see straight up which of the specs and classes have been played just in the last few days without having to account for weeks and weeks and weeks ago of numbers. So what we have, it's actually still not changing too much from our previous numbers. The top specs, the more popular specs, have remained the same 5 or 6 because Balance, Beast Mastery, Arms, Havoc, Shadow Priest and Fire Mage are the same 6 specs that were the most popular in 9.1 up to last week. Perhaps a little bit more interesting is the fact that we pointed out for a few weeks up to last week that Fire Mage was overtaking Frost because more and more players were going over Fire. This patch, Frost Mage has received a tiny-ish single target buff, so it is not too surprising that in just the first week of the new patch, Frost Mage is much closer now to Fire Mage. There are more players trying out Frost, perhaps to give a try to the buffs that Frost received. As for the other specs, there aren't too many surprises. We do have to point out, however, that Elemental Shaman continues to drop lower and lower in ranks. Remember that at some point Elemental was close to the top 10. Now instead they have been beaten by Enhancement Shaman. You know, being beaten by Enhancement Shaman is more or less the last proof that you are playing a niche hipster spec if Enhancement can beat you. And no real surprise at the fact that Beast Mastery is now comfortably holding the reins of the Hunter specs, the ranged Hunter specs, because there are basically twice as many BM Hunters than there are Marksmanship Hunters. Beast Mastery has gotten buffed particularly for the lifting of the AoE cap to their Beast Cleave, which is very powerful. Not as much in raids. We will go and take a look probably tomorrow for Mythic Plus, how this has affected the class. But even in raid encounters, it continues to be one of the more popular specs. Unsurprisingly, the popularity of healers and tanks is not moving too much. We still have the stalemate between Restoration Shaman and Holy Paladin as the most popular, and then pretty much halfway down you have Holy Priest, closely followed by Restoration Druid. This has remained more or less the same. The only thing worth noting is that Mistweaver Monk is being more represented compared to the last patch. as also at the moment Mistweaver is very powerful as far as HPS goes. They do still suffer from the age-old problem of not having a damage reduction big cooldown like Spirit Link, like or a Mastery or like Barrier, so that is still going to be the crux of the spec for the time being. Not too many differences on tanks either. Blood DK has solidified itself as the most popular of the tank specs a few weeks ago and has remained this way even after this reset of the counter for specs playing in Mythic Raiding. And then you have the similar situation in the middle where Vengeance, Protection, Paladin and Guardian Druid are reasonably close to each other compared to the bottom tank spec, which is Protection Warrior. That is clearly the least played of the tanks. Now, for a moment, let's go and take a look at the performance. The logs are still, of course, young, they are new, but we can perhaps still draw some conclusions. Now, the conclusion to draw is that the rogue specs are still there. They are still all towards the top, just like before this patch. The main change for the moment is one of the largest jumps we have seen recently, which is Fury Warrior. Because Fury Warrior, the last time we took a look, was at the bottom, was essentially the third worst melee spec. It was only ahead of Unholy DK and the perennially at the bottom Enhancement Shaman. Instead, now, with just some 10,000 parses, they have gotten themselves in the top 5, which is an interesting jump. Some other specs have been moving around 3 to 4 positions, like Havoc. Demon Hunter has now gone up and performing better. You have gotten Retribution Paladin also going higher than previously expected. Frost Mage, which is weird because, as we just pointed out, more mages have gone Frost compared to previous. Instead, at the very least, what the overall performance tells us, Frost Mage has been doing worse than before 9.1.5. Talking about jumps, there is also another jump, but this is also very volatile and inconsistent. It's the jump of Survival Hunter. Back before this patch, Survival was the only standout Hunter spec that was doing nicely, more or less, when it came to raid encounters, and now, in the first week of this patch, Survival has now decided to be a good brother and go join the other Hunter specs at the bottom. Talking about jumping around, we mentioned Frost Mage going a little bit worse between the patches. One spec that has gone a little bit better between the patches is Arcane Mage. Arcane Mage was battling in the middle against Fire Mage. Fire Mage has more or less remained where it was, while Arcane has been performing better in the first week of this patch. Meanwhile, we continue, very confusingly, to have no change, more or less, for Warlocks. Demonology continue to be the best performing spec of Warlocks by quite a bit, and at the same time, Destruction, while still being a very popular spec, continues to be one of the worst performing specs in the game, including the worst performing range DPS spec in the game. Now, after we have gone to take a look at the current situation, we can go and now look at the change of the patch, the 9.1.5 that allows you to move around between covenants. So, has there been any movement in between specs choosing to play a different covenant for the raids compared to Mythic Plus, for example, since now they can. If they want to do it, they can. If we start with the melee DPS, this was their situation in the raid right before 9.1.5, and this is their situation after the release of 9.1.5. Now, of course, the numbers for the moment are still rather tiny, the changes, the switches in Covenants, mostly because we have a large amount of numbers logged from the previous patch, so it's going to take a while before the numbers are going to take a bigger swing. But we can start already to see some patterns, some tiny, 3 to 4 to 5% changes here and there. Outlaw Rogue is playing a little bit more of Necrolord in raid encounters as opposed to Ventir. You have an over 10% drop, a 13% drop of Enhancement Shamans going away from Night Fae in raids to try out Ventir. You have Frost DKs getting almost 20% more popular for Necrolord in raid encounters, as well as a 13% switch of Survival Hunters going from Kyrian to Night Fae in raid encounters, and even Unholy DKs dropping their 97% Necrolord in raids to become a little bit more of a Ventir build. The bigger change, however, clearly in this switch is to Havoc Demon Hunter. Havoc was primarily Night Fae for both builds, for both activities, up to 9.1, and then with the ability to change around, we see that they went from their 94% Night Fae in 9.1 to their 55% Night Fae and 41% Ventir in 9.1.5 when it comes to raids. So that is one of the first major changes that we can already see after just 5 days of this patch, which is pretty relevant because imagine in 2, 3, or 4 weeks how more drastic these changes can be, which is good for the game, for the ability to always be fresh and have something interesting to do, now that you can change covenants at will. What about the range DPS? Well, the range DPS had a problem that we pointed out before, which was their dominance of Night Fae for most of these specs. When we look at the raid, this was the situation in 9.1. Has it changed or has it not in 9.1.5? So we pointed out one of the downsides if you were looking at playing Warlock in this patch, the fact that one of the major benefits of being able to switch covenants for this patch would not really have applied to Warlocks because their Night Fae covenant is clearly the strongest one. And you can see it here as well. There is just a 5% drop for Affliction, and in fact Demonology and Destruction are even rising in their popularity of Night Fae, so no real change to note when it comes to Warlocks, and in fact no real change when it comes to most of the other range specs. We are talking about 3 to 5, perhaps 7% changes here and there, but nothing major when it comes to range DPS for now. There are going to be, at the very least, some more interesting changes when it comes to Mythic Plus, which you will see probably tomorrow, but as far as raiding is concerned, not too many changes. What about now the tanks and the healers? So as far as tanks are concerned, there are some more attempts of DKs to move away from Necrolord when it comes to raiding. We do have way more Brewmaster Monks trying out other covenants other than Kyrian when it comes to raiding, a 20% drop compared to 9.1. Same goes for Guardian Druid, who is trying out Ventir in raid encounters compared to the Night Fae they have been for the entire expansion, pretty much. We do have a slow rise of Protection Paladin when it comes to Ventir. This is one of the builds that is likely going to continue to grow over time, since Ventir is very good for Prot Paladin in raids, whereas Vengeance and Protection Warrior don't really change too much. Lastly, we do have the healers and their changes. Compared to 9.1, Discipline Priests are back once again, trying more Ventir compared to their normal Kyrian build. Holy Paladins surprisingly have been dropping a bit of Ventir for raid encounters. Perhaps they are trying to parse a little bit higher in HPS now that they are done parsing in damage. Maybe that's the reason. Holy Priest continues to be a jack of all trades, wanting and willing to play multiple covenants. Before they were split between Kyrian and Night Fae, and now they are still split between Kyrian and Night Fae in an even tighter race than before. No significant change for Mistweaver Monk, no significant change for Restoration Druid either. Slight change for Shaman, a little bit less Necrolord in order to try other builds, particularly Ventir and Night Fae. And you see, when we go over all of these changes, it's good. It's good that these changes are happening, even if they are just a 5% change, perhaps a 7% change, because first of all, as mentioned already, we are just 5 days into the patch, so we are bound to get more and more over the course of this patch. It's not that everyone had the time to instantly change Covenant and bring it up to 60, 70, 80 renown in the first few days, so eventually in the following weeks we will have more players willing to try out different Covenants. I myself am in that position. I don't really want to go into a raid with my renown 57 Covenant just because it's new. I would rather wait a week or so before I can. That's probably the situation many other players are in, so the deeper we go, the more changes we will be able to see. Positive changes, because diversity is a strength when it comes to the options, the avenues that you have to play your character. Another thing that we could touch on was the nerfs being placed on the raid. Ner'zhul was nerfed, Soul Render was nerfed, Painsmith was nerfed, perhaps buffed, and then Sylvanas was nerfed as well, slightly. So a couple of weeks ago, this was essentially the kill chance of bosses. How likely were you in your group to take down the boss at any given try? So what do we have 2 weeks later? Now we see that the Taragru is still kind of the same. The 9 has increased by 10%, which is cool. And then you have Eye of the Jailer also increasing by a little bit, over a 10% increase. Guardian of the First Ones, surprisingly, is actually causing more wipes than before. But the main things we were interested in were the nerfed bosses, Soul Render and Ner'zhul. Soul Render went from an 8.5% chance to a 10.5%, which is a 25% increase in the likelihood of you being able to kill Soul Render. Ner'zhul went from 7.9 to 9.9. This is almost a 30% increase on the chances of killing Ner'zhul. Kel'Thuzad wasn't really touched this patch and remained pretty much the same in 9.1.5. Fate Scribe also slight increase over time, just guilds getting better at killing the boss. The other nerfed boss, which we wondered whether or not it was an actual nerf or not, which was removing the bowls mechanics in the first intermission. Some people posed the question that it might have been a buff to the boss rather than a nerf, because it made progressing on the boss harder, since you would have had to wait until the second intermission before trying the tough part, instead of immediately wiping, if you were to wipe, immediately wiping on the first intermission and spend less time on the boss, essentially. Well, turns out it is still an increase. 2.8 to 3.3, 0.5%, that is a 20% increase as well for Painsmith kill chance. And also worth mentioning, Sylvanas went up a tiny bit. At the end of the day, probably as planned, I guess we have to say, the largest increases in kill chances have been on the nerfed bosses, Soul Render, Ner'zhul, and Painsmith. So I guess these nerfs have done the proper job that they were intended to do. So after going through the kill chance of bosses, we can stop and take a break. We have gone over and taken a look at how the current situation in the raid in almost the first week has been going. As pointed out already, the situation is likely going to continue to evolve when it comes to the flexibility and the fluidity of Covenant usage by different specs. We will eventually also go and take a look at Mythic Plus and how these Covenant changes have affected Mythic Plus, with the added possible interesting point of the AoE cap being lifted, which is going to play a bigger role in Mythic Plus than it has in Raid Encounters. So for now, however, we can stop here. As usual, as is the customs in these videos, thank you for watching the video. If you've enjoyed this content and you want to continue to support this channel, you can leave a like on the video, you can comment down below, as well as subscribing to the channel, but only if you look out of the window and right now it's raining, just like it is here. See you guys soon, and in the meantime,